Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Today we're checking out a brand new monitor from MSI that surely has the name in the top 10 worst I've ever seen testing monitors over the years. Seriously, we're looking at the MSI Artymis 273CQRX-QD. That is a shocker. The naming division at MSI never ceases to amaze me with the trash they come up with. This name is almost impossible to remember, so I'm going to rename it the MSI 273C for short. What's so special about this monitor? Well, let's talk about the specs. 27-inch, 1440p, 240Hz VA monitor with listed 1 millisecond response times. Sounds an awful lot like a monitor I've tested previously. Yes, the Samsung Odyssey G7. On paper at least, both the MSI 273C and the Samsung Odyssey G7 have the same basic specifications, with MSI clearly positioning their model as a high-end monitor. They even talk about quantum dots, which the Odyssey also has. It's branded QLED after all. We don't have US pricing just yet, but locally here in Australia, it's set at just $50 cheaper than the Odyssey G7, so right in that premium category. Unfortunately though, this monitor serves as a great lesson for buyers, a lesson to not just blindly trust the spec sheet. A bit of a spoiler alert, but of the MSI and Samsung models, only one gets even close to the rated 1 millisecond response time in practice. And I'm telling you right now, it's not this one. So we're going to break down some of the issues with this display as we go and look at why it ultimately kind of sucks as a gaming monitor. The design is fairly typical of other MSI high-end gaming monitors, which usually come with plenty of gamer aesthetic, probably second to the Asus ROG line overall in terms of gamery stuff. For example, there's an angular design on the back, many different textures of plastic, and of course, the obligatory RGB LED elements, which aren't very useful aside from increasing the parts cost. Being so curved, it's quite a chunky display, but you usually don't notice this or whatever design is used on the back while using it. However, you do tend to notice the front, and MSI has gone for what can only be described as a thick chin. The rest of the bezels are normal, but yeah, this bottom edge is quite large and protrudes from the rest of the display, which I don't think looks very good. In the center, you'll notice a circular sensor cutout. You might think this is a webcam or some other type of camera, but no, it's just an ambient light sensor for use with MSI's smart brightness feature. Auto brightness is kinda neat and can be customized here to your liking, but surely there was a better way to integrate this rather small light sensor without making the entire bottom bezel so chunky. The stand is pleasingly functional though. We get metal legs, height adjustment, a bit of swivel support too, so the overall ergonomic options are decent. No pivot support though, which I guess makes sense for a monitor with such a curve. It's also very sturdy and resistant to wobble, something I would definitely expect in this price range. As for the curve, it's the same 1000R curve as seen with the Odyssey G7, so the same pros and cons apply here. For gaming, it's only a minor annoyance. I still definitely prefer flat screens of this size and aspect ratio, but for productivity work, it's not great. The curve can distort imagery, and while you may get used to it over time, this distortion will always be apparent when using other flat displays nearby, such as for a secondary display or laptop. Viewing angles are also limited by it, though overall this monitor's viewing angles are fine. MSI has packed in a lot of features here, including all the usual stuff like crosshairs, shadow boosting modes, and the increasingly common KVM switch. Some of these features, like the smart crosshair and smart brightness, claim to be using AI calculations, but this is almost certainly a huge exaggeration of the very simple algorithm actually being used, but hey, AI is a buzzword these days. While some of these features sound a bit gimmicky, there are a few that are genuinely useful. The one I want to highlight is True Color Sync, which allows you to upload calibration profiles to the monitor. This is usually only available for professional grade monitors, so it's great to see it come across to a gaming display. With that said, I've always found MSI's gaming OSD software to be a bit painful to use, and it's no exception even today, with references to laptops during the calibration process showing a clear lack of attention to detail. Now we get into the bad stuff. The whole reason why the Samsung Odyssey G7 was so popular was its killer VA gaming performance. Never before had we seen such excellent performance from this type of LCD monitor, with Samsung figuring out a way to effectively eliminate dark level smearing while maintaining a great contrast ratio. With the MSI 273C, you don't get this at all. We're just right back to the bad old days of poor VA response time performance. Here's the normal mode, 15 millisecond average response times, pretty slow across the board, but thankfully no overshoot. Not ideal of course, and on its own this wouldn't be a major issue as we can simply crank up the overdrive, but when we do this and look at the fast mode, It's not a great deal faster. We've moved up to a 12.6 millisecond gray to gray average, but the cumulative deviation is still 800, which is well above the threshold I like to see for modern gaming monitors, somewhere around 500. And this is especially true for a 240Hz monitor like this. The worst part is when we move up to the fastest overdrive setting on offer, faster. This setting only improves us to a 9.2 millisecond gray to gray average, and there is clear evidence of dark level smearing. This presents itself as ugly dark trails following moving objects, something we'll show later in this video. And while cumulative deviation is still better in this mode than previous modes, it's not ideal, and some overshoot is starting to creep in. Most notably, refresh rate compliance is poor at just 39%, which prevents us from getting the benefits of true 240Hz monitors that have better compliance. When compliance isn't very high, the level of motion blur limits the display and stops high refresh rates from looking clearer than lower refresh rates, and for this panel it seems like around 200 to 165Hz is the maximum. Across the refresh range, the faster mode is suitable for a wide range of refresh rates, but it's not exactly an ideal experience as performance is still relatively slow. We only reach decent levels of refresh compliance around 165Hz, and you can see here that response times are still an issue. Down near 100Hz we have the added issue of overshoot, which becomes slightly noticeable, and at 85Hz it's not great. But then at 60Hz the monitor switches to different behavior and becomes usable again. I'm not sure if this is variable overdrive or just the monitor running at 120Hz to display 60fps content. Around the 85Hz mark you will get a better experience dropping the overdrive setting to fast, but elsewhere I'd recommend faster. The MSI 273C gets close to a single overdrive mode experience, but ultimately falls just short due to some loose performance at refresh rates below 100Hz. I'm also not sure whether you'd really want to call this a great experience anyway, given the bad performance at 240Hz and low refresh compliance. However, if you do buy this display, most of the time the faster mode is the best way to use it. The gaming performance is a major issue for this display. Despite featuring the same specs on paper, the Odyssey G7 absolutely destroys the MSI model in motion clarity. It's not even close. The Samsung variant is nearly 3 times faster, which is embarrassing for MSI's V8 equivalent. It's a night and day difference while gaming. The Odyssey is simply far clearer when playing at the maximum 240Hz, but it's not just the Odyssey comparison that is unfavorable for the MSI monitor. It's also most other 240Hz displays you can get today. Many IPS variants, including the recently released Gigabyte M27QX for just $500 US, simply have much better response time experiences. If gaming is something you plan on doing a lot, I can't recommend this display. Other charts don't look much better. For average performance, the MSI 273C can claw back some speed at lower refresh rates, but it doesn't help it standing all that much. The Odyssey G7 is still roughly twice as fast, and most IPS monitors are better as well, especially if you're getting something premium like the AW2721D or PG279QM. But the major issue is dark level performance. The 273C has dark level smearing. Other high-end 240Hz displays, including the Odyssey G7, have little to no dark level smearing. Samsung's VA tuning, for example, sees them achieve nearly 3 times better dark level performance than the MSI model, and a typical IPS is well over twice as fast for dark transitions. The only positive I can say here is that this MSI display isn't the outright worst example I've seen of dark level smearing, but it's certainly far from ideal, especially for a fast 240Hz display. This hurts cumulative deviation. This is probably the most favorable metric for the MSI 273C, but it's still 89% worse than the Odyssey G7 and above the usual range I think is acceptable for modern premium gaming displays, which is the 500 to 600 range. For gaming, I find it quite hard to justify this performance. It just isn't good enough and is notably worse than its competitors. Around 120Hz is probably where the MSI 273C is the most competitive. We do still see dark level smearing, but the average transition time is passable, though there is a lot of overshoot. I still wouldn't buy this over the Odyssey G7, which is clearly superior. Then there's 60Hz performance, and while there are a few other models that also perform poorly like the M27QX, a handful perform really well, including Samsung's equivalent. Moving on now to input latency, and the 273C is disappointing for a 240Hz display. This is because while the refresh rate is solid, response times are not and cause a delay to seeing the final image on your screen. The processing lag is also passable at 1.1 milliseconds, but it just doesn't feel as responsive in gaming as compared to the best 240Hz plus monitors you can get. Power consumption is a mixed result. The MSI variant is more efficient than Samsung's Odyssey G7 by 8 watts, which is a pretty solid difference for this size of display, but it's also far from the most efficient overall, comfortably beaten by some IPS monitors. I don't think this is a big issue by any stretch, though it's mostly a non-issue. The MSI 273C also supports backlight strobing technology, but the results are terrible, so I wouldn't recommend using this feature. At 240Hz, the response performance simply isn't fast enough to accommodate backlight strobing, so we get horrible crosstalk and double images. You can also see here clearly the dark trails following dark moving objects thanks to dark smearing. It's quite ugly in comparison to what the Odyssey G7 is capable of. While MSI does include the ability to use adaptive sync and strobing at the same time on this model, I just don't think it's worth using. Not everything about this monitor is bad though, and there are some redeeming features in color quality. Despite both the MSI 273C and Odyssey G7 using quantum dot enhancement layers in their panel, the MSI model has a notably wider color gamut. We're getting 96% DCI-P3 coverage, which is pretty similar to Samsung, but the MSI variant has additional coverage into the green area, which provides 94% Adobe RGB coverage as well, which is reasonable, though not perfect for color work in that spectrum. This leads to a total Rec 2020 coverage of 82%, which is very strong and a good 10 percentage points higher than Samsung. Despite this, the curved nature of the panel doesn't make the display ideal for color accurate work in gamuts like Adobe RGB, so the only major benefit would be for content consumption. Out of the box, grayscale calibration is decent. MSI provides a good color temperature without tracking, and while the gamma doesn't follow the sRGB curve perfectly, it's a reasonably flat 2.2, which is the next best thing. This leads to a respectable Delta E average that is better than average for a gaming monitor. However, the default mode leaves the wide color gamut totally unclamped, so when viewing regular SDR content and stuff mastered for the default Rec 709 color gamut, you will see oversaturation, which leads to poor Delta E's in other color focus tests. What we end up getting is better than average grayscale performance from the factory compared to other monitors, but weaker than average color checker performance. Most very wide gamut monitors have issues in this chart, as the wider the gamut, the greater the oversaturation will be if there's no correction applied by default. While the default mode doesn't deliver the factory calibration MSI promises, they show a Delta E of less than 2 on their website, there are several other modes that do. The sRGB mode, aside from the usual locking of color controls, is pretty good. Grayscale performance doesn't change much, but the emulation of the sRGB color space is effective and leads to a much better level of saturation for regular content you might be viewing, like this YouTube video, which is encoded to use this color space. There are also specific modes for P3 and Adobe RGB. Both modes are effective, but not quite as effective as the sRGB mode, mostly because this display doesn't quite cover the full extent of both color spaces. Adobe RGB is actually slightly better here due to the use of flat 2.2 gamma, which the MSI monitor provides for all modes. To improve accuracy beyond this, we need to run a full calibration. This display does have the option of hardware calibration, which is handy for some use cases, however it only supports colorimeter devices. For all our other calibrations, we use a spectroradiometer, which is a much more accurate device, so we're sticking to our standard CalMan workflow here. As expected, there are no major issues here after the full calibration, aside from at the very edges of wide color spaces like P3, where the monitor can't quite cover them. Maximum brightness in the SDR mode is above average for a VA monitor, coming in at 430 nits, quite a lot brighter than the Odyssey G7. However, both monitors are still bright enough for indoor use, as I suspect a lot of people won't run them at maximum brightness unless they have a lot of sunlight in the room. Minimum brightness, also okay at 53 nits. One of the major strengths of this display, and probably the only reason you would remotely consider it, is the contrast ratio. This panel is capable of deep blacks, resulting in a native contrast of 3686 to 1, which outside of OLED displays is very good. It's quite a bit higher than the Odyssey G7 again, but typical of older VA panels where 3000 to 1 was a safe minimum. Obviously, the performance is far superior to IPS-based LCDs, which are garbage in comparison. Then for uniformity, wasn't super wrapped with this aspect of the Odyssey G7, but the MSI 273C does better. There are still some pockets where performance deviates from the center, and viewing at off angles can make backlight bleed much more visible for dark content, but generally speaking the uniformity was okay here. The final section of this review is the Hub Essentials checklist. In the first section, the only major concern is the use of HDMI 2.0 rather than 2.1, which limits the refresh rate over HDMI to just 144Hz, rather disappointing for a 240Hz display. However, the color aspects were strong and advertised correctly, including factory calibration, though the sRGB mode having locked settings is another disappointment. Where MSI stumbles is in the motion section. This display has an advertised 1 millisecond MPRT response time, which technically doesn't refer to grey-to-grey transitions that we measure, but I don't think the average buyer would actually know there is a difference. In any case, real performance is far from 1 millisecond, so this is quite misleading, especially as the average response time is actually 9 times higher, and motion performance is bad overall. However, the absolute fastest response times I measured were around 1 millisecond, so at least that wasn't too inaccurate. Unfortunately, several other areas of performance were also a fail. As for HDR performance, this is a fake HDR monitor, which isn't unusual given it's only display HDR 400 certified, which is a pointless certification. The main issue here is the lack of local dimming. It's not implemented at all, so we don't get much better than native contrast. Lastly, I was pleased to see that unlike the Odyssey G7, scan lines are not an issue here. However, I did spot a very minor amount of backlight brightness fluctuation in our adaptive sync test around the refresh rate floor. It's not too noticeable, but any flickering at all causes us to put up a fail mark in the checklist, so that's something to be aware of. When I was asked if I wanted to review the MSI Artymis 273CQRX-QD, I was really hoping that it would deliver excellent gaming performance. It's supposed to have very similar specifications to the Samsung Odyssey G7, which has been available for ages and performs very well for a VA LCD. Unfortunately, the spec sheet is quite misleading, and ultimately, this display is a huge failure in terms of competing with the Odyssey and other 1440p 240Hz gaming monitors. The major issue is the same major issue with most other VA monitors: response time performance, specifically dark level smearing. This is why I don't recommend VA very often, especially to high-end shoppers. The motion performance is simply terrible in comparison to today's IPS products, and if you're not getting a massive discount to make up for it, there's no way I can recommend it. Basically, this expensive monitor performs just like an entry-level VA from years ago in motion. The issue is compounded here because there is one family of monitors that solved the dark performance problem, the Odyssey line from Samsung. So when you look at the spec sheet and compare it to a known good product like the Odyssey G7, you might be fooled into thinking the MSI 273C performs just as well because key specs like their 1 millisecond response time are the same. But actually, they're basically at opposite ends of the spectrum in performance, and the MSI model is clearly using much more inferior hardware than the Samsung equivalent. Companies like MSI have had nearly 2 years to match Samsung in VA performance. Not even getting close, but then attempting to charge almost as much is pretty embarrassing. Luckily, there are some good areas to this monitor. The color performance is very good. It has one of the widest gamuts I've seen for a VA panel. It has an excellent contrast ratio. The factory calibrated display modes are solid, and it even supports hardware calibration. You could almost make the case that it's a good monitor for watching videos or doing color work, but the aggressive 1000R curve kind of negates that to some degree. For people after a versatile 240Hz gaming and creator display, I'd just recommend one of the several great flat IPS products, or for gamers after great contrast, the Odyssey G7 is a far better choice. I really don't think it's worth spending any more time talking about this monitor because I don't think you should buy it. I actually hope companies stop making high-end expensive VA monitors until they can at least match the Odyssey G7 in performance. If your product has dark level smearing, you just can't justify selling it for flagship prices no matter how many other features you try and cram in there. Anyway, that's it for this review. If you've enjoyed our monitor reviews, whether that's this one or some of the other reviews we have up on the channel, please do consider supporting us through our Patreon and Floatplane accounts. Links are in the description below. You get access to live streams, our Discord chat, ICC profiles, all sorts of good stuff. Alternatively, just subscribe to Hardware Unboxed. Anyway, that's it. Thanks for watching. I'll catch you in the next one.